Blog Talk Radio.
Live from the nation's capital, it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry, with host Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Quintessential Listening Poetry. Tonight is a very special night. Our guest is Heather Corbally Bryant. Heather, are you there?
I am there, Michael, yes.
All right, fantastic. You can read about Heather's accomplishments, which are many, on the episode information page. I just want to get started here. Heather, do you think that you were born to be a poet?
Oh, gosh. I wish I could say that. I mean, I always wanted to be one, and I actually have a poem about that. I told my father when I was in college that I wanted to be a poet, and there was a really long, awful silence after that. But I secretly started writing poems in my notebooks when I was supposed to be listening to the lecture.
Okay.
And that's pretty much how it started.
Well, you said you have a poem that you wrote about being a poet.
I do.
Would you like to read that one first? I think that would be a
great
one for us.
It's about being a poet, and also about my poetic influences. It might be what you would say an homage poem to Seamus Heaney, who was one of the most important poets to me. So yes. I'll read it. It's called Listening to Seamus Heaney, and it's in several parts. So part one, the first time I heard this man read, I thought I was sophisticated, but really I was so young, a sophomore in college. I sat between my mother and my father. I was so busy, too busy to meet them for this occasion. I remember how the words spilled forth that April afternoon from Heaney, the first living poet I had heard speak. I remember the sounds of the syllables, a poem called Mint, written after the death of his mother, the aroma of the mint she grew in her garden. Afterwards, I told my father I wanted to be a poet. He had been bemused, but my world had changed. I had heard a person explain the sorcery between the conception of an idea and a dream, and how that magic makes a poem. I was so busy, or so I thought, to take Heaney's course on prosody, too busy to know my own truth. As a young married woman, I heard him read for the second time in Manchester to a crowd-filled November room. He was famous by then, but still so humble. He explained the origins of one of his poems, how the idea of procreation had come to him when he had peeked out his window to see the black bag his mother's doctor carried with him every time just before another brother or sister arrived. He described how he thought the baby came in the bag when he was supposed to be sleeping. I did not have children then, but yearned for them, longed to be a mother. I listened to how he spoke as both son and father. I cursed myself for not taking his course when it was right in front of me, everything there, but for the asking. Of course, I read every word he wrote throughout the years, and I thought often of how he spoke, reminded once again alone at Harvard on a warm October evening when the Cambridge Fire Brigade had to intervene because students filled the pathways blocking the corridors, a hazard to public safety. The chief fire marshal ordered half the audience outside where they went, disgruntled and disobliged, hanging on the windowsills by their fingertips, to hear Heaney's words floating through the fall evenings. By then I had children, but I was already distrusting the contours of my life. I found his poems a comfort. Just knowing he inhabited the universe gave me hope. So I stood alone in a long line, waiting to have open ground signed. He looked up at me after scribbling his name and said, "Good luck," or "Godspeed." I can't remember which, and I left that room, carrying the memory of him with me, as someone who would always bear the truth of word and soul. I reread Mint in the days following my own mother's death, and then I thought of how words could live forever, but not people. Just the memory of his voice reading came alive to me, his words always with me. The notice of his death that August morning, close after my own mother's, came as a shock. His voice stilled, impossible. So that's it.
Wow, it's beautiful. How has your idea of poetry, how has your idea of what poetry is and what poetry can do changed since you began writing poetry?
That's a good question. Well,
thank you.
I actually, it is. I read, believe it or not, I read an article in Reader's Digest magazine, probably when my kids were little and I was in a waiting room somewhere. I think having little kids always involves waiting. And it said, it was something like, so you want to be a poet, write a poem a day. And I thought, okay, well, that's easy. I started doing that, and it was August 15th of 2002. I do remember that. And at first I thought poetry had to be by men, because I'd only mostly read men and had men lecture to me. And then I thought that poetry had to be very serious and important and incomprehensible, because that's what much of it was to me. But I think the big thing that happened for me was it went from being something that that funny noise in the background, I got a new puppy today, which is a side note. But anyway, I started thinking that poetry was something that I could claim, that it didn't have to be by old dead white men, and that it could be by me and lots of other people, and that it could make a difference in the world. And I know that sounds really cliched, but
no, it doesn't.
There's a side note to the Heaney poem, which is that I showed it to a friend who knows Mara Heaney, Seamus Heaney's widow, and my friend said, you should send that poem to her. And I thought, oh gosh, really? But I did, and she wrote me back the most beautiful note, and she said, you know, he lives on in your words and everyone else's, so he's not really dead. And I just love that. So that's been my evolution, and I just did the math before I called you, because I like to be as accurate as I can. So as of today, I have 5,722 poems.
You've written 5,722 poems. At least. I mean,
at least, yeah. It's probably more. That's the minimum.
5,000.
I won't read them all.
Did you hear that, everyone? 5,722 poems, at least. Well, let me ask this question. What advice would you give to an aspiring poet?
Well, I would say try to write every day a little bit. And I would also say to lower your standards, because a lot of my students say...
What does that mean, lower your standards?
Well, that it doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be a certain way, and you can always go back to it. As Seamus Heaney said, revision is sweet. And that I think that a lot of times people are intimidated that, well, they can't be a poet because they don't know how to do it. And I think everyone has poetry in them, really.
Mm. Why do you say that?
Because a lot of times when I have my students do random exercises, I don't teach poetry usually. I teach more expository writing, but a lot of times I'll say, well, just write about what you're thinking or what happened with the reading, or sometimes I'll bring in some really random thing like an orange and an apple and say, write about them. And I'm amazed at how many students write poems while declaring that they're not really poems.
Right.
But they are poetic, and they have music and rhythm and voice in them.
Well, share one of your 5,722 poems with us. Another one of your poems.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So
this is your hour.
I'll share an early, right? Yeah, don't worry. I'll limit myself. It's a little scary. I'll just say that there's a cupboard in my house that I think is supposed to be for linens, and it's filled with notebooks.
Okay.
Instead of sheets. But the first time a friend of mine said, you should send out your stuff, and that's a whole other story. But I started writing, in earnest in 2002, and I started writing about very ordinary things. And so I think I'll read an ordinary poem.
All right.
It's called Lady Slippers on Pinnacle Road. Along curving roads we walk, pressing on towards orchards, spreading over hillsides, green now, making fruit and leaves for summer shade. Stone walls line old fields marking boundaries, where land has been won, lost, sold, and fought over. It has rained for a week, but today the air begins to lighten, as though it needs not hold so much moisture anymore. A small verdant patch of wild grass grows up a ways from the road. Dew glistens on tall blades. 3 lady slippers sprout up, perfectly formed, jaunty, tender, their blossoms elegant on rigid stems, pink globes of brightness, guardians protecting our path.
I'm going to ask you a question. I ask a lot of questions.
Sure. That's good.
Writers and poets, thank you. Writers and poets write for a myriad of reasons. Some write primarily to speak a message to the audience. Others write because to stay silent is not an option. Why do you write? And maybe you've already answered it, but it's a different spin on the question.
Yeah, I mean, that's another great question. I think I write for many reasons. Partly now because I can't stay silent, and partly to figure things out in my head,
All right.
and partly because I think I started, when I started forcing myself to write a poem a day, I started noticing more things around me every day. And so for me, poetry is really an act of noticing, and I'm not a particularly political person,
Okay.
and I'm actually kind of shy, but for me, poetry has become almost a way of being in the world, I guess is how I would put it. It's a way of making sense of things, and if I can ever bring comfort to people, that's important to me, or to speak truths that aren't spoken, and obviously that's at least very much on my mind right now.
Well, please share another piece.
Sure. So I think I'll share one since I've spoken about not being silent. One collection I wrote is called My Wedding Dress, and it has a collection of wedding dresses on the cover, and sometimes my students think, they're like, oh, that looks like such a happy book, the wedding dresses, and I always feel that I have to warn them. Actually, it's a little bit tough. It's about actually escaping an abusive marriage, and part of why I started writing in earnest was when I started realizing that I was going to need to leave the marriage, and it was not going to be easy. So, should I read a longer one or a shorter one? What do you think?
Read a nice long one.
A long one. Okay. So, and this is a book that I sent out really to the universe saying, I only sent it out to one place. And I thought, okay, either it's going to get picked or it's not. And that the universe will decide for me what happens. So I'll read one. I'll read the title poem. It's called My Wedding Dress. And there's an epigraph from the Odyssey. I saw no irony in the name of the designer who fashioned my wedding dress. No irony in purchasing my gown at a store called Calypso, also on an island, in this case Bermuda. It was a simple cotton eyelet lace mid-calf garment bought on the whirlwind of my last vacation with my parents before I married. We hopped on bus on a humid August noon. In town, my father persuaded me to take a peek inside the store where he thought there might just be something for me. I tried the white dress on for all of 5 minutes. Size 6 fit me perfectly. No alterations needed. I clutched the pink bag decorated with gold letters, grabbing the goddess of temptation, who persuaded Odysseus to tarry long, listening to her ambrosial songs until wiser heads prevailed, and he set forth again on his long-delayed journey home, where his wife Penelope was waiting for him. Once he displayed his knowledge of the trick of the bed, and his faithful dog Argus recognized him, then love was put to rights, a marriage restored, domestic tranquility preserved. I drew comfort from the simplicity of my wedding dress. It symbolized my confidence that I knew what I was doing as I stepped down the red-carpeted aisle towards my beaming husband-to-be, steadied by my father's arm. I believed we loved each other with all our hearts, and so I could promise to love for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. I believed we could sail through whatever storms life held in store for us, whatever journeys, it's just my puppy, we undertook. It would be the two of us forever. All marriages must endure, sometimes less, sometimes more, if they are to last. My maid of honor tied and then retied my sash, a last-minute dash to find something blue, a handkerchief from someone's pocket, her initials embroidered in turquoise. My father appeared with a shiny sixpence, my shoe, brought back from his last trip to London. Even though I knew he had his doubts, he granted me the dignity of a beautiful wedding day. There would be no hesitating now. Slowly up the stairs to wait in the vestibule for the trumpet voluntary to begin. He whispered in my ear that he hoped the sixpence would bring me luck. My father, ostensibly the least sentimental of men, offered me this promise of good fortune, this token with its beveled edges that I had tucked away in my jewelry box. Just the other day, I found it beside the pregnancy sticks that had turned blue, notes addressed to the tooth fairy, a purple and green bracelet my daughter made in 3rd grade for Mother's Day, the hospital tag I wore on my wrist the day our twins were born, the tiny anklet identification, his own LoJack, we joked, for our youngest son, his name and number matching mine. For years, my wedding dress hung at the back of my closet as we moved from graduate student apartments and then from house to house until one April morning when my husband told me he was no longer sure whether he loved me. I knew in my heart he was acting differently. There was a dissonance between his words and his actions, a gap I couldn't explain as I saw the sun fall across his face beside our bedroom window. We were not where he wanted us to be, not after 15 years of marriage then. That was news to me. I stayed awake night after night as he flew around the country, assuming I knew where he was and what he was doing. How wrong could I be? But at the time, all I could think to do was take my wedding dress to the quality dry cleaners, where I brought his shirts every week. After all, they promised. love and memories preserved forever. 8 years later, 500 miles away, legally separated, I reached the top shelf of our cedar closet and grabbed the white box. I clutched the plastic handle to pull it down to the ground, smoothing over the pink receipt. I note the salient facts. I took the dress to the cleaners on the 23rd of April, Shakespeare's birthday. I remember a clerk telling me the lace had yellowed some. They would do their best, but they might not be able to make it pristine again. I said that was all right with me. In her rounded hand, she pressed hard and wrote in loops, "One wedding gown, clean and preserved." She gave me a paper to sign, accepting the risk that it might not come entirely white again, even though I knew I was only trying to stem the damage. The receipt said it would cost $110, requiring a minimum deposit of $75 to begin the work, the total coming to more than half of what the dress had cost. My father liked to brag that he found me a beautiful wedding gown, but it had not broken the bank. Never mind. He did not mind finding a good bargain. My daughter used to wonder aloud when she looked at the pictures from our reception why my dress had not had a train. Why had it been so plain? She was sure, even at 7 years of age, that she would want a fancier wedding than her father and I had, and I think it's safe to assume she will not want to wear my dress, nor I think what I have wanted her to. Some decades later, I haul the white box containing my wedding dress to the St. Vincent de Paul store, where I hope it may give another woman a chance at happiness. After I drive away from leaving the box just outside the back door, plastic handle still intact, I return home in the rain, only to have my husband call to ask if he can move back in again. I know then the only answer I can give to his question.
What did you learn about yourself from writing that piece?
Oh, gosh. Well, the whole sequence of these poems, I think what I learned was I was kind of borrowing a truth from myself, and a lot of the poems allowed me to uncover what I was really thinking and feeling that I hadn't allowed myself to think or feel for many years. So the act of, I suppose another reason I write poetry is the act of understanding that comes from that act of writing. And putting together things that you often don't realize are put together in your life. I think that's one thing I find really satisfying about poetry, is that things that seem ostensibly unrelated, like my taking the dress to the cleaners, at the time I sort of thought, well, no, that would be a good thing to do. And later I thought, well, it was Shakespeare's birthday, and the store really was called Calypso. And the symbols that you don't see in your own life, and that other people don't see.
I can understand that. Well, let's take a brief break, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
To Quintessential Listening Poetry. I'm here with Heather Corbally Bryant, and she's sharing some of her incredible work. The call-in number, if you'd like to call in, is 646-787-1631. And Heather, actually, we have a caller on the line.
Oh, my gosh. Okay.
All right. Well, I'm going to click over, and let's see what happens. All right. Area code 781. The first three numbers are 329. You're on the air. Hello?
Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
you're on the air.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, Lynn.
Okay. I have a question for Heather.
Yes.
Of all of the books that you have written so far, which one is your favorite and why?
Oh wow, that's another really good question. I've never really thought about that. I guess I would have maybe different favorites for different reasons, but if I had to pick the one that I'm maybe most, well, I shouldn't say most proud of, but the one that maybe has the most poetic integrity, I think it's Thunderstorm. And I think that I have a range in that book that I really appreciate, and a complexity that of the way it's structured that I didn't realize at the time.
Oh, can you talk about how it's structured?
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite things about putting books together is thinking about how to structure them. And a lot of times they have sort of secret structures that nobody else knows but me because their poetry's so obscure. Mm-hmm. So the structure of that one is really about the journey of the weather, and it starts with my Seamus Heaney poem, which is like my poetic beginning, and then I move through some of my darker end of marriage poems, and I move into nature, which I found very healing at the time, journey through nature, and I move through landscapes from New England to Pennsylvania to New England and back to Pennsylvania, which has pretty much been the journey of my life of and then coming back. So that book is structured.
Right.
And that's how many books ago? Where does that fall?
So that falls, let me think about this. I think that Cheap Grace was first, Lottery Ticket was next. The third was Compass Rose. Then my wedding dress. It was my fifth one, and it was my second long book. So it was my fifth. It was deep into my publishing, but the way that I organize books is really the most interesting thing to me of all. One of the most interesting things about poetry is thinking about adjacency, and that's something I studied a lot in grad school, is how one poem looks different next to a different poem. A lot of times poems draw meaning from the poems that surround them. I love that idea.
Thank you, caller.
You're welcome.
All right.
Yeah, thank you, caller.
Yes. What kind of work are you most drawn to reading yourself? I know that you've, again, extremely prolific, thousands of poems. What kinds of works are you drawn to reading yourself?
I'll read anything, really, any kind of poetry. I've gone through phases. I went through a big epic phase where I read a lot of epic poems. And then in grad school, my favorite poets to study were Yeats, Stevens, Eliot, and Pound. They were my four sort of big guys. And then I started realizing, other people besides, as I said, dead white men write poetry. So I started going to bookstores and looking for obscure poets, just literally reading down shelves of poetry. And there's some poets I like a lot who are not as well known. There's a poet named Elizabeth Spires, who I love, who is not as well known. And then I went through the big Plath, Sexton, kind of angry, depressed women poet phase. And now I try to keep up on, anything that's published in the New Yorker, obviously, or the Atlantic. And I go to a lot of readings, and I look up people who are less known, because I'm really struck by that. The first woman poet I heard read ever was Carol Muskie Dukes.
All right.
And I love her work. Another less well-known poet.
What about it do you love?
The music of her work, and also the fact that she would write about things that other people wouldn't talk about. I thought that was really interesting. That, first I thought poetry had to be about nature, and then I thought it had to be about Greece or Rome. It took me a while to realize, you can write about anything in the world that matters to you. And I started loving Tracy K. Smith. She came to Wellesley. She was the graduation speaker last year. Natasha Trethaway. Kevin Young I heard read last spring. A lot of Irish poets I love, like Mary Madak, Joan McBreen. I mean, I'm very, promiscuous with my poetry taste.
All right.
I like what people might consider, high poetry or low poetry. I've started to get more interested in spoken word poetry. So I'm especially interested in poetry that transforms an ordinary experience into more of a fable or something that's ordinary but recognizable. Because to me, that's the magic of poetry, is how do you take ordinary everyday experience and transform it into something that is art and that is appealing to a large audience, that other people can find meaning in. And that's something that continues to fascinate me. I publish my poems in books, but also online on medium.com. And I often will try to write about something that's happened in the world that I can try to make meaning out of. I had, after the election, not the most recent one, but the previous one, I wrote a haiku. I remember I went to campus and it was so eerily quiet and hushed, and everybody seemed so loud and also so heartbroken, and haiku about the sky, because that was all I could think of to say.
Well,
at that moment.
Please share another of your works. Please share another of your work.
Okay. Do you have anything in particular in mind, or just have me pick?
Let's see, which one? I liked all the ones that you shared with me.
Okay, I'll read one.
James Joyce's
Water
one? Closet. Yes, James Joyce's Water Closet.
Oh, yeah. Actually, that one, I don't have a copy of right with me right now. I can run and get it.
Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I know where it is.
Okay,
if you could read it, that would be great. And then I know which one I'll be. Yeah.
Okay, all right then. This is James Joyce's Water Closet, which I dedicate to Heather Corbally Bryant. All right. By the River Liffey, we pass a brick row of houses, yellow doors swung, halfway open as beckoning us inside. The rooms are open, airy and spare, empty of furniture, just musty paintings, nothing left over of life lived. There, only the creaky stairs, bumpy rails, uneven floors. We step across the threshold and climb up to the top where my children pull the string on to flush the toilet. So many times it snaps in their hands. I apologize. And we continue towards the dining room where we pause. Walls, maroon and green. This is the scene I recognize, the place where the place where Joyce wrote his ghostly story, The Dead. Here is where his pen gave his character's life. As we descend, I see him sitting and writing there. James Joyce's Water Closet. All right.
Thank you for reading that. It's always fun to hear a poem, in someone else's voice, because you obviously see different things in it, and that was really exactly what happened. We were in Dublin, and the kids were little, and we went into James Joyce's house, and they'd never seen one of those tanks up high, and they pulled it so many times it broke, and it just struck me there was something absolutely ludicrous about that happening at that moment, especially since Joyce wrote so much about bathrooms and bathroom humor and et cetera. It just seemed really comical to me, and I wanted to write about it. And so that's the title of my next collection, which should be out in about 3 weeks. I just finished the final galleys for it. So
right.
I'm excited about that.
Available on
And then I have
Amazon?
A poem. It'll be available on Amazon and the Finishing Line Press website.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. And then I have another one that's about, it's from my collection called Eve's Lament, which is, I gathered several of my poems that I wrote when the kids were younger. And I thought they provided kind of a cohesion. And we used to live in an apple orchard, so there was a lot of apple things going on. And this one is called Eve's Lament. You sat and stared in the mirror, wishing and wishing someone else could be there, that you could fill yourself up with something that might last. The waters rippled, and your face teetered, shaking in the sunshine. I dared to tell you some things first. Remember, like who began the life of sin, an apple plucked right out of a tree.
All right. Are you there?
And that, I'm here, yep. That poem,
Okay.
yeah, it might speak for itself. I don't know.
Well, I've got another question for you. No, not another question. Let's hear another poem.
Okay. Another poem. Okay. Well, I think I'll read one. Sometimes I share with my students poems that I'm writing. That was something when I went to one of Seamus Heaney's readings. He would share poems he was working on, which I absolutely loved. I thought that was just a gift kind of to see, a poem or a poet in process, as it were. Because, we often don't see that. I also like to think of poems as being, what's the word, like fluid, that they move and they change. And I think it was Galway Cannell who said that he would see his own work in a store and he would go in and change it. He would make marks like he wasn't done with it.
Oh, wow.
He would think that he was constantly revising. So, sometimes people at readings will say to me, how do you know when a poem is finished? And I often give that example that you don't know really when a poem is finished. You can always go back to it, and you can always change it or see it another way, really. So I'll read this one. I'm kind of fascinated by convenience stores. It's funny. One of my poem collections is called Lottery Ticket. And when my mom heard the name of that, she said, "Do you buy lottery tickets?" And I said, "No, I just go to convenience stores." There was one I loved because you could get coffee and the newspaper when people read print newspapers, and you could mail things. So it's where I mailed some of my first poems out from. But now there's another convenience store I like where the woman sells me coffee for 50 cents instead of $1. I'm not a coffee snob. So this is called October Morning at the Convenience Store. A pack of Jimmy Swift's mint, please. 1 pack, please. I'm blind as a bat. Are you two together? Can you help me see the numbers? Over $1 billion lottery today has drawn these people here, all in search of a better chance. I come for the 50-cent coffee, cheaper than Starbucks or Pete's. We are all the same, really, waiting in line on one chilly October morning, waiting for a second chance.
I was in that same line. I didn't see you, but I was in a line like that.
Right?
And very disappointed that I did not win. So you need to know that.
Right. I'm
doubt
sorry.
that Quintessential listening would be still on the air if I had won.
Right.
But
you
of course I didn't. But I would have come back just for you.
Taken off for. Yeah, thank you. I know that would have been terrible, or actually wonderful. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
You talked about convenience
there's
stores.
Something fascinating. Oh, go ahead.
No, you talked about convenience stores as being the theme of some of your work. What are some of the other predominant themes in your work?
So it's funny, I also don't really think of myself as a nature person, but I think that when I look through them, there's actually more nature than I would imagine. And, when my kids were little, there was a lot of little kid things. There are a lot of themes of femaleness. I think a lot of women poets have not been given enough of a voice. So there's that. There's regional themes. There's a lot of kind of veiled politics along the way. Trying to think of some other ones. I used to play this game with my kids when I was driving them to school every day. Everyone has to notice one new thing on this road every day, because it was the same road every day. And I kind of set myself that same task, and that's part of the poem a day thing, that every day I'll say, okay, there's something I'm going to notice today that's going to be a poem, and they don't know what it is. So it's kind of magical for me, because I just don't know what it will be. And telling me that come out in the landscape. So I have another one that I wrote recently that I could read if you wanted.
Please.
That winds a couple things together, and I'll explain afterwards. I also love going to readings and finding out what the poet thought. That's like really, I feel like it's like a. So it's called Taking the Tree Down, late October. The trunk stands alone, shooting up skywards, having lost the company of its branches. The arms are chopped off one by one, then stacked in neat piles, according to size, ready to head to some wood stoves or fireplaces. The branches appear aloof now, as if they have lost their stamina. I think of phantom limb pain and how it's not phantom at all if it can be felt. Nothing phantom about it. Those limbs that were once attached in place, ordinary, all in a day's work, that now have been left only to recrimination, reminiscence, impossible to rearrange the life that once was. Stark reminders all.
Do you sit and think through every word of every stanza, or do you write freely and allow the words to flow?
I write freely and I allow the words to flow, and then sometimes writing in coffee shops or airports or train stations, and so I just completely let it flow out. So that came from, I actually took my students on a field trip to Walden Pond because I'm teaching a course on noticing. And on the way, I saw this tree, and I've had two friends in the last couple of years who've become paraplegics, really out of the blue, both of them. And they're both working on rehab, and I think about them a lot because they're dear people and they've had awful experiences. And for some reason in my head, the tree, in the process of being torn down, and my friends came together in my mind. And that's often what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other big place that I get inspiration from, thinking of people who might be interested in writing, is I guess some people might call it a found poem, where you see, words that speak to you somewhere, and you make a poem out of it. And sometimes people just take, words and cross them out and make a new rearrangement. But this one I found on a bus, and I thought it was a compelling line. So it's called "This Vehicle Has Been Checked for Sleeping Children." Today I sat in a traffic jam behind a yellow school bus, the small kind for kindergartners, and because the light was long, I had a lot of time to study the back of the bus. I got close enough to read the handwritten sign taped inside the back window. This vehicle has been checked for sleeping children. And I thought about what those words meant and why they had to be there at all in the first place. And then I realized how many children I had read about who end up left on buses or sent to the wrong town. And I thought again about randomness, about the panic of a parent who realizes a child has gone missing, and the terror accompanying those moments of imagined loss, how our hearts immediately start pounding, how we are wired to know where our children are, to know they are as safe as is humanly possible. And I thought about how very big the world is and how small each one of us really is, and what a miracle it is that any one of us is here at all in the first place. When the glistening cells begin to grow within us, or when we gather up another woman's child into our arms, loving a baby into our life, that is where the beauty comes, in knowing that love can be made flesh, and that flesh can be loved forever and ever, no matter the beginning, village, city, country, world, universe.
Speaking of universe, poets are from all over the world. Where do you hail from?
So I grew up outside Boston in Lexington, where the revolution supposedly began. And I think the theme of my life that's sort of comical is that I was only in New England. I never went anywhere. I mean, I grew up there. I went to college 10 miles down the road. And then when I got into grad school, I went to Michigan, which was a huge change for me. It was my big foray into the Midwest.
All right.
Big state university, completely foreign to me. And then I moved back to New England because I got a job here. And then I moved to Pennsylvania. I got a job there. And then I moved back to New England, and I hope I'm here to stay. I've enjoyed exploring other parts. I don't know if you know that the New York Times quiz.
Well, let me ask this question then. Again, you're extremely prolific, so it seems as if, to me, you're writing all the time. Right or wrong, I don't know, but it sounds like you're writing all the time. Some poets are also
write a lot.
Some poets are also active in other creative areas. What are some of your favorite non-poetry or literature activities?
Oh, non-writing activities?
Yes.
Well, so I love to swim, and I get some really good ideas from swimming. I love to read. I don't know, that probably counts as a poetry-related activity. I love to teach, and I love to travel. I think travel that's been a gift, a more recent gift. I've traveled for work and for writing, and that's been a real gift for me to see other parts of the world.
Now, I know that you read publicly. Am I correct? That you share your work in terms of reading. What is the relationship? We're going to switch gears here. What is the relationship between your speaking voice and your written voice?
Oh, yes, really good questions.
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
Yeah, that's why you didn't really need that lottery ticket, right?
I got to do something. I got to earn a living.
Exactly. I think my written voice, I think, tends to be more serious and perhaps philosophical and maybe lugubrious. One of my kids said, "Your poems are so dark." And I think my speaking voice, I hope, is lighter and more humorous. I don't have a lot of humor. I don't think I'm very good at humor in my written work. But when I give readings, I try to be humorous, and I try to not take myself too seriously. I mean, I do think it is ridiculous that I have written so many poems, and a lot of them are not really poems. They're more scribbles or, pieces of poems. So I think when I give a reading, apart from being on the radio, I really like to try to connect with my audience and find what they're interested in and why they showed up. Because people show up at poetry readings for lots of different reasons.
Yes. Yes, they do. What conditions help you write?
Well, it's funny. I used to complain that I couldn't write at home because my kids were around. I had 3 kids in 3 years. I had twins and then a third child all in 3 years. So it's very hectic. So I used to complain that it was my kids, and we had dogs. I mean, there was a million reasons why I couldn't write at home. And so I would go to coffee shops or other places. And then, now I'm kind of an empty nester. And my kids are launched and come back every now and then, but not much. And sometimes I still can't write at home, which is pretty comical because there's literally no reason why I couldn't. So I think I've decided I prefer places where there's a little bit of noise. I love writing in places of transit, in kind of liminal spaces, like on trains, on buses, on planes, waiting for all those things. Often when I'm driving, I used to drive a lot when I lived in Pennsylvania because everything was very far away. And I drove a lot, and I would sometimes write a poem when I was driving. I mean, that sounds alarming, but, I would see something, lines would come to me, and I would kind of force myself to remember them, and I would turn them over in my head. And a lot of times they would turn into, lasting poems. It was quite surprising that way. And so I think being in transit helps me to think.
So if you think about your process, is it pen and paper, computers, notebooks? I know you've got a lot of notebooks. How do you write?
Yeah, so it's really pen and paper. I'm really a pen and paper person, and I've developed sort of bizarre ritual of, I think all writers have weird rituals, and I buy these really cheap notebooks at CVS, the ones that cost like 49 cents on sale.
Mhm.
And I write in pen. I don't like writing in pencil, so I write in pen. And then what I realized, I'd fill up these notebooks because they have 70 pages, so I'd fill them up pretty fast.
Mhm.
And then, but I forgot to put the years on them. So then I realized, like, oh no, I can't remember which year is which when there started being so many. So now I put the year. And then what I do when I want to put together a collection is I go through them and I start thinking, these poems seem like they go together. Like, here's a theme that I see kind of coming together. And I'll start playing with them. And when I type them up, I start to make changes in them. I think that's what starts to happen. I start to fiddle with them. And like even James Joyce's Weather Closet that you read so beautifully, there's a couple of awkward lines, I think, and I just made some changes on the galleys last week. So I fiddle with them as I type them, and then I fiddle with them before they go into publications. And that's really my process. Sometimes I'll say to myself, okay, you should write a broken sonnet or a three stanza poem, or occasionally I have a poem that I wrote a really long time ago that's a sestina that I think is a really interesting form. So sometimes I'll set myself a challenge of writing to a certain kind of form, because that's a way of, I think for poets, and it's something that I would recommend for anybody who wants to write, is it's a way of expanding what you're doing, because having the limits of the form and the challenges allows you to try things.
Well, that was actually my next question. What style of poetry do you prefer? Freestyle, rhyming, haiku? That was my question.
Oh, my gosh. That's funny. We're on the same wavelength in the convenience store line, right? I like all forms of poetry, really. I can't think of a form that I don't really like. I mean, I write a fair amount of free verse. I write haikus. One thing I like to do is string haikus together. So, I mean, it's tough to get a solo haiku that is really powerful. So I like stringing them together. I did that with a sequence of poems about the fall. I strung a series of haikus together. And then I've taught the last couple of summers, I've taught a poetry workshop in the summer, and I've assigned my students sestinas, and they found them really hard, but they've really loved them. And so that's a form I like a lot. I also write a lot of broken sonnets. That's probably my most common form. But I really, I love language. I love playing with language in many different ways.
Well, please share one more. We're almost out of time, but I want you to share one more piece with us.
Okay, well, I'll share one that's my sestina. It's from Lottery Ticket, actually. And I wrote it a really long time ago, and there's a reference in it that makes me sound like a dinosaur. You'll hear it. So,
okay.
When it is dark, a sestina. When it is dark and I am not with you, I will begin and go to a place we have not been. There it will be warm and we can find light. You will bring the light, always with you. It is not dark. When you arrive, warm, I will see Morocco with you, even where we have never been. Now, together we will go to Morocco, where long ago others before sought the light, yet other lands where I have been have seemed strange and dark. Here now with you, finally, the sun feels warm. But if you leave, the warmth vanishes. And when I go, there will not be in us, a me and you, always the African morning light, striking oranges and women, dark and strange, in these places we have been. always there now when we have been to these lands. I remember moments, warm and instants, where there is a quick, dark click of a camera, where I go to record this deepening light along with you, together now, me and you, in this distant terrain of never been and still to be. The noon light slices through, and our bodies warm, while on the go, we never reach the end till dark. Always the light or the warmth fades quickly. You and I go where we have never been, into the falling dark.
Very nice.
Thank you. And I wrote that. It's funny. I mean, I wrote that when I was probably like 22 years old. So it's when people still had cameras that made noises.
Okay. Well, let me ask this question. When people hear your work, they usually want more. What's next for you as a poet? You've accomplished so much.
What's next for me? Oh, well, I'm really excited because I love islands. So I've put my next really big collection that's going to come out. It'll be in probably the winter or spring of 2019. Is my longest book by far. I think it's about 70 pages.
All right.
And it's called Island Dream Songs. And it's the first half is about Greece. It's called Leaving Santorini. And the second half is called Visiting Lissadell. It's about Ireland. So that's my next really big work that will come out. So James Joyce's Water Closet will come out, as I said, in a few weeks, and then Island Dream Songs will be my next big one. And I'm working on a collection right now. It's called Between Then and Now, and it's really about the passage of time. And I found in that closet a folder, and it was just labeled Poems Written in the 1980s.
Okay.
So I've been going through those, and they're typed on onion skin paper, and I don't even remember writing many of them. So I'm going through them, and I think that's going to be my next sequence, really. It's going to be called Between Then and Now, about the passage of time. So, as you can tell, I have a lot of ideas.
You do? Well, we've reached the end of the hour. You made my night.
Wow.
I want to say thank you so much for sharing your talent with us. And because you've got so many poems, I'd like to invite you to come back in 2019 and maybe before to share some more of your work. I mean, I want to hear more, and I'm sure that our audience does too.
Oh my gosh, I would love to. I mean, we have many thousands to go.
That's true. You really don't need me. You don't need me. You don't need me.
Well, no, I
do. You could just read and read and read. I can
That'd
just
be
sit
a
back
little
and
scary.
listen.
Oh my
Well,
gosh. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for making this such a wonderful experience. I would love to come back.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that. All right. Have a great evening.
Hey, you too. Thank you. Good night.
All right. Good night.